Hi there, this is Pais Chance, and today I am here to talk to you about the magic world of coding using abilities, UI, and balls of plasma. This tutorial is for an intermediate coding skill level. This means that you already know what are the types you're using and the basic programming instructions are clear to you. If you don't know what types and namespace are, or you don't know from where to begin to write in Lua, check my other video that will pop up somewhere on the screen. How to start coding in Core. Inside this video, two sections will be presented to you. Within the first one, you will begin from the code of my already mentioned video and you will build the logic of two abilities, making clean and reusable scripts. Inside the second section, we will instead create an UI interface for these abilities, for the player to let him know about his life and mana, erasers he will use to cast his spells, and lastly, we will add magic circles spawned during the cast phases of our abilities. Now, to begin, I will refresh your memory about a few important arguments we will see in this section: the context and abilities. A context is a special folder that can be networked or not that apply to all the files within the same context. So, for example, a client context folder will apply to all his files a client context. There are multiple contexts, but we will focus on the client and the networked ones. Grouping files inside a client context means that they are now only within the client side of the game, so the server and the network won't be able to modify them, and the other way around, because they will be only on the personal computer of the player. The networked context, instead, is somewhere in the middle, because it can be modified from the server and the client, so it can be used in many ways, but it's also the more performance-demanding context. Another important information to know is that the client context have always the game collision turned off, something you need to remember, because trigger inside this context can work only if you turn the game collision back on. Abilities are instead gameplay components which, through usually equipments or weapons, binds a key to a certain action of the player, so using an ability, we can shoot or reload or aim. These abilities are divided in phases: cast, execute, recovery, cooldown, and ready. In each one, you can code using a script that links the phase to a function, and we already did so in the last script in a very simple manner. Before opening Core and the editor, let's talk about what we want to achieve. Then we will create a small flowchart for each action. First of all, we want to be able to touch a trigger, a source of plasma, and get a ball of plasma, without having the limits of the trigger as we did in the old script. Then, adding a second ball of plasma with different properties, like the creation of a shield that will negate all damages for a short period of time, we want to switch between them to use their abilities. When the usability is called, using what we already have written for it in the other script, we want to be able to trigger the ball of plasma in front of us, without knowing which ball it is. So these simple actions can be summarized with three flowcharts. The first two are just actions and consequences. So if player touch plasma source, then get plasma ball, and if switch is called, then switch the plasma balls. The third one is a bit more complex, but nothing too hard to write. So if use is called, we have to check which ball is in front of us. It can be plasma or shield. In both cases, the first operation is the same: link listeners to the other ability phases and link local variables to the optional arguments broadcasted with the event. Then, for the plasma, we can use the old script. so it will be launched forward. In the cooldown phase it will scale up. Then, in the ready phase, it will create an explosion, damaging everything around the template, and finally it will come back, scaling back down to its original size. For the shield use instead, we will change its position, bringing it to the player. Then we will spawn the shield effects asset, where we will check if the player is taking damage, and if it is, we are going to negate it. And lastly, we will bring the ball back to its position, resetting everything. Using these flowcharts, we now have a mental image of what we need to achieve, and you can now open Core and its editor. First thing we will change is the trigger, because we need the plasma source inside an interactable trigger. Then we have to add within this trigger a new script that will react to the interacted event of the parent trigger, broadcasting to the client, or if it is already inside the client, normally broadcasting the template of the ball that the source spawns and the template that will be created when the use ability is called. For the plasma ball, this will be the plasma ball itself and the explosion that will be drag and drop on the script from the templates. Now pause the video and try to write the simple script yourself using the right naming conventions and the core API, remembering to put the trigger dot is interactable to false at the end of the function and to check if the code works with the preview. Welcome back! Now I will show you how I made the script, but remember that it's not that important if it's different, it just needs to work. Let's now head to the main script, where, if you downloaded the community content asset, there will be already many lines written. Here we won't have need anymore for the trigger and templates variables, because everything will be broadcasted from the trigger script we just created. We will instead use, in place of all these other variables, a list. We need now to change our setTemplate function. We will add a template number within the arguments to allow multiple balls. We will modify the forward versor that will change with the template number. Something simple like this, it's okay to start. And finally, we will remove the task.wait. We can now go down to the spawn things on interacted function. This function, that will be the one called when the event is broadcasted from the trigger, will have a temporary new table in which we will store the template returned from the set template, using as argument the template itself, the ball sent with the broadcast, a distance and a length of our list plus 1. The second key of this temporary table will need to be the template that will be spawned upon use. Then you will have to insert inside the list this table. Remove now, if you have them, the two functions called with the trigger events, and the trigger event itself, adding the listener for the broadcast, calling the function we just wrote. Remove also, again if you have them, the functions that were called with the ability phases, but not the listeners of the ability execute and ability ready, because we will use them. For those who have not downloaded the community content asset, you will need to generate a new script for an ability with execute, cooldown and ready phases, where, for each one of these, a custom broadcast will be sent, with as argument, for only the cooldown broadcast, the remaining phase time. Lastly, we need to change the tick function, where you need to check each list entry with a for loop to set them properly, using the index of this loop as the final argument for the setTemplate function, ending it with a task.waitTime that will replace the one we erased from the setTemplate function. Now let's create another ability that we will call switch, binding it to the right click and a script that we'll only need the execute phase function, where an event will be broadcasted. After adding them both into the equipment we will use, together with the usability and its script, remembering to put the script inside a client context, we need to head back to the main script, where we have to add the listener for said event and the function that will be called. Inside this function, the logic will simply remove the first entry of the list of balls, saving it inside a temporary variable, then adding it again within the list, action that will place it at the end of the list itself. To finish off the main script, we need now two more functions for the usability execute and ready phases. Within the execute, we will have to broadcast which ball is in front of the player, with its usability template to make the ball act. Furthermore, we are going to need something to turn off the set template movement done inside the tick function for the duration of the usability. An easy way to do so is using a flag initialized to false, true inside the execute, false again within the ready. This flag, added as a check for an if statement nested within the for loop of the tick function, will give the mean to disable temporarily the setTemplate function. Having done so, we have finished the main script and we just need to code the logic for the plasma and shield balls, which scripts will be added inside the templates of the balls spawned when the player will touch the triggers. As you can see, I created multiple generic scripts, because this way, these scripts will be reusable in the future, even in other projects, being not linked directly to template and variables of this scene. The plasma ball will be easy to code, because it's basically the same as in the original code. Within this script, in fact, we are going to need the setTemplate function again, but we can easily copy and paste it, remembering that we will need this function only to move a single template this time, not spawn, nor move multiple templates. Then we need to connect the listener to the events broadcasted from the execute phase of the main script. The function called with this listener will check with an if statement if the template parent of the script, the plasma ball spawned, is the same that was broadcasted from the main script, to be sure that this is the first ball of the list. Next, we save the useTemplate broadcasted with setTemplate at a high distance, I use 1200, and we link, saving them inside variables, the listener to the ability cooldown and ability ready. Inside the function called by the ability cooldown, the template scale will need to be increased. Within the function called by the ability ready, instead, the usability will be spawned. Then, using a function of the world namespace, find objects overlapping sphere, we will store in a local variable the array of objects that were overlapping said sphere diameter. We can now cycle through this array with a for loop, and for each damageable object, we will broadcast to the server with an event naming like the damage and the damageable object itself. After all of this, there is only need to scale back the template and reset the variables and listeners. This is how a listener can be disconnected. Knowing all of this, pause the video and try to write the script by yourself, then unpause it and we will see together how I did it. Welcome back, let's see how I did it, but remember, your solution could be different from mine and still be right, because we are trying to solve a problem, but the way to the solution can be different for everyone. We now need to set up the last scripts of this section, the shield one that will be divided in two scripts to make it more easy to read and understand, and the server damage script that we already introduced in the last script we saw. As within the plasma script, we will reuse the setTemplate function, but returning this time a new raycast with a downward direction that we are going to use to find where the floor is. The function called from the listener to the main script event that the code is for me in the last script will be actually almost identical. The only difference will be the distance, that is going to be 0. This is because we want the shield ball to go to the player's position to spawn the shield. Then, when the ability goes in the cooldown phase, we will spawn the shield, which will have its own script, and when it comes back to the ready phase, we will reset every variable used, we will destroy the shield instance we spawned, and we will reset the listeners. Take now your time, pause the video, and again try to write your code. Welcome back! This time it should have been easier to do, having already wrote the first one. This is the script I wrote for the shield. The second shield script will be added inside the template spawned upon use, that will be composed of the effects of the shield and the trigger with the same measures as the shield itself. Inside the script there will be a listener, using the damaged event of the player, that will call a function with an if checking if the player is inside the trigger and the damage received is more than 0, so it won't trigger with healing. If this is the case, then it will spawn an asset with a simple shield hit FX and will broadcast to the server a negative damage, erasing basically the damage received. The last script that will be inside a server and context folder within the equipment we created will need listeners for the equipped event and an equipped event. Inside the function called by the equipped event, there will be the listener for the damage, that will simply apply the damage to the damageable that is passed through the broadcast to server. Thus, we finished the ability section. Now you can interact with one or both triggers, switch the balls gravitating near you, and use different abilities with the same binding. Now we will begin the UI section. Here we will build a simple UI structure with the two abilities, mana and health containers, then we will rig them to the right resources. In total, we will write 3 other scripts. We will add a couple lines inside the main script, and we will pass a UI image from the trigger to the interacting player. Additionally, in the end, we will see how to add a vanishing magic circle to our abilities to give a fanciness boost to our equipment. I'm not much of an UI guy, so it will be fairly simple. Add a client context to the world. Within this context, add a UI container in which you will create 3 UI panels, representing the health bar, the mana bar and the abilities. Add a progress bar within the health and mana panels, and customize them as you like. Instead, within the abilities UI panels, add 1 or more background images, 3 panels, 1 for each ability, because the plasma and shield ones are going to be separate, even if they share the same binding. Then again, customize everything as you like. Setting quickly everything up, the scene should now look something like this. Now, returning to the programming, let's create 2 scripts that we will put inside each of the bars. In the health bar script, we will simply drag and drop the progress bar. Then, using the tick function, we will set its progress variable equal to the player hit points divided for its max hit points. This equation will give us the percentage of hit points remaining to the player. Similar to this, within the mana bar script, we will drag its progress bar and using the tick function we will take the progress variable and we will put it equal to the equation created from getting the resource of mana divided for 100, our max mana, finding and finally the percentage of remaining mana. Now we will write the equipment server script, which will initialize and modify health and mana. The script, which is none other than the last script of the previous section, will not only now damage the player, but will also take mana away when casting and slowly regenerate both resources. Additionally, we will also see two very useful practices. The first one is to write a nameless function when initializing the listener for an event, to not create too many one-use-only functions. The second one will be the usage of the task.spawn, which will create a secondary task in parallel to the main one, so that the functions will be able to act in the same frames, and of the two variables, repeat interval and repeat count, which are respectively how many seconds we have to pass from one instance of the function spawned to the next one, and how many times it will be repeated. To begin, we will add another listener, which we will use for the mana event, and two variables for the two tasks we will spawn. Inside the function called upon equip of our equipment, then we will set the player resource of mana, initialized to 100, and we will write mana task equal task.spawn, open and close parentheses. Inside, we will write function open and close parentheses, and after this, simply an if statement that will add a number of mana points you like, if the mana points are appropriately low. If we didn't check it, it could go above the max mana points, creating a problem for us. After this, we'll set the repeat interval of mana task to 2, and the repeat count of mana task to -1, which indicates an infinite time of repeats. You will add then the same for the health task, checking also if it's more than 0, which indicates the death of the player, setting then the repeat interval to a value you like and the repeat count to -1 again. I will leave this task.spawn to you, so pause the video and try to write it. Welcome back. This is how I did it. Next, we need to initialize the mana listener, and we can do so by calling a nameless function as we did for the task spawn, and checking if the mana is insufficient, in which case we won't detract the spell cost or not. Now we can rewrite the health listener in the same way. Lastly, inside the function called by the unequip event, we will need to cancel the two tasks and reset the listener as usual. Let's now briefly go to the main script, where we just need to add inside the function called by the ability execute a get resource mana, to get how much mana the player still has, and an if to see if there is enough mana for the spell to cast. If this is the case, a broadcast will be sent to the server with the event name you chose for the mana event listener we just wrote. For me, it was mana damage with the argument of 50, which is the spell cost. Next, we add a new UI image for the spell within the script of its own trigger, alongside its other template, and within the script, we broadcast it as another argument. The last script we need to write will be positioned inside the client context of the UI, and will need as custom properties the equipment, the UI container, the 3 panels of the abilities, and the 2 icon images of the left-click abilities. Then, we will add a table and a listener for the switch ability as variables. Listeners to the equip and unequip events will call respectively a function that, if the player equipping is the same player returned from the game.localPlayer, will initialize the switch listener and will change the visibility of the UI container to inherit, and a function that will reset the listener and change the visibility of the UI container back to force off. A listener will then use to check when the plasma ball triggers will be interacted with, to insert in the table the UI image and call a function. This function, reused also by the function called by the switch listener, will check if the first of the table is not nil, and if it's not, will change the visibility of the front image to inherit, then set the image to the first UI image of the table. Then we will check if it's not nil the second index, change to inherit the visibilities of the second ability and the switch ability, then set the retro image to the second image of the list. Finally, the switch ability will trigger a very similar reaction as in the main script, because it will remove, storing it into a temporary variable, the first entry of the table, then insert it again inside the list, calling then the function we just wrote. To finish, change the visibilities inside the editor to force off of the UI container and the UI panels of the three abilities. Now let's talk about the magic circles. I've already prepared them for you to dissect inside the community content of this tutorial, but they are fairly simple to understand. Each circle is a separate template that just gets spawned from the main script and have an independent script that make all the circle and effects appear and disappear. What you need to write in there is basically the link to each part of the circle template. Then you have to find the opacity bar of that asset and use a lerp function inside a for loop to smoothly make the transitions, to make them appear and then, after a while, disappear. It's also easier to set the template fully visible, then, by script, get that value in a variable and set the property to 0 or equal. Not every core object have a simple opacity bar, but there is an equal property for any one of them. For example, the magic circle effect have the emissive smart property, so you will need to use the setter and getter for smart properties. For the volumes effect, the opacity bar is the density, or, another example, for the sound, the opacity equal is the volume, which plays the same role. Instead, the lerp function is a useful core math command to remember, because it takes as arguments a beginning value, a final value, and a percentage of transition from the first to the latter. So, using the for loop we mentioned above, we can smoothly transition in a timing we like. So, what you need to do is to find the right timing for everything to appear and disappear, then create the script. These are examples of this. Now put everything inside a networked client context and set its lifespan equal to the timing you choose writing the script. To make this template appear, we just need to add a broadcast to the ability cast phase of the use ability. Then add a listener inside the main script that will then spawn the respective circle. This circle will have to be headed in the trigger custom properties of the same ball and broadcasted as argument to the main script, that will then store it inside the table we use to store the balls and uses. This finishes our second section of this tutorial, because you have now a fully functional equipment with not so common abilities and a UI that will help the player navigate the game. You can now continue alone and add many other features. Examples could be adding the cooldown to the UI, which is pretty simple to code. If you are interested in this topic, I suggest you to see the D&D framework. Or you can set up a better UI with more bars and resources, transforming it into a survival-like game. If you are interested, I suggest you to search for survival within the community content assets, because there are already many great scripts from which you can learn, including my assets. Or you can simply make a better geo for the equipment, which right now is simply a ball, so it's not very usable inside a proper game. Try as much as you can and understand how the code is made, finding new useful interactions and documenting yourself within the core API and the Lua APIs you can find online. And if you make mistakes, don't worry, because everyone makes them. I hope you will find this tutorial useful and not too boring, and if you want to support me or my channel, leave a like, subscribe and write me a comment on what you liked or didn't like in the video. Everything you saw in this video will be in a community content asset with the same name as the video, so feel free to download it and play with the scripts. See ya!